Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson. Chapter 2, Part 2. 4. He saw his chance after breakfast, and took it with marked promptitude. She had slipped out alone. He saw that, for he was becoming very conscious of her indeed. And as Mrs. Bessington, still discoursing, turned to answer a question from one of the unknown ladies, he produced his cigarette case as a kind of guarantee of good faith to any who might be observing his movement, and slipped out also. She was already halfway up the tiny path, but he was with her before she had reached the end. They sat down presently with their backs to a broken wall, a little way off from the path. Neville was aware with considerable satisfaction that there would be quite a good time before they need go, as the party, generally speaking, was due to undertake a small exploration in the catacomb under the guidance of the Trappist lay brother. But he thought he would make sure of his good fortune. "You don't want to go down again?" he said. She shook her head. "No, I think I've seen enough to get its message," she said, smiling. "Besides, Mrs. Hecker has interpreted it all for us, hasn't she?" There was just a tinge of bitterness in her voice. And I don't like—" She stopped. "What do you think of it all? It's your first visit, isn't it?" Neville drew out a cigarette before answering. "Yes, it's my first visit. Of course, it's very interesting and romantic. I suppose everybody feels that. But I still feel what I said the other day." "Yes?" "Well, I quite see the drama of it all. The very same service performed in the very same language, and all that. In the very same place where the slaves and so on heard it all those ages ago. And, of course, as a Catholic—" "Go on," she said quietly. "Well, of course, as a Catholic, I think it very sacred and all that. But, you know, it seems to me they've missed the point somehow. I can't imagine what I should have done if I'd been a Christian in those days," he added, rather irrelevantly. "Don't you think that it was fresh and new then, in the same way that other things are fresh and new now? We should both have been Christians, I mean really fervent Christians then, I think." "By George!" said Neville, "I believe you've hit it. You mean that since we don't live in those days, Christianity seems, well, rather stale. That it is stale. I don't mean that it isn't true," he went on rather anxiously. "That's different, but that the spirit of it is stale and conventional, and that the point just now lies somewhere else." She bowed her head in assent. His delight was deepening into something rather like ecstasy. Never in the whole of his life had he met any one who understood, as she did, this particular side of his nature. More than that, she illuminated it and made it coherent, it seemed. His deep little convictions, half formed and inchoate, his views about health and freshness and solitude, even of qualified solitude, those were coming out from him, one by one, drawn by the warmth of her presence, and really they were not so bad after all. It appeared to him that she must be extraordinarily spiritual and good to understand like this. He had had no conception that women could be like this, so delicately strong, so resonant, so to speak, instead of flabby. He turned to look at her a little more lowly, excited by his pleasure, and what he saw flushed his intellectual happiness with an even more elementary emotion. She was leaning back again now against the old lichened wall, with her head thrown back and her big gray eyes looking out across the sunlit garden. She had unbound her hat, and the scarf lay in her lap, and the broad, soft black straw cast a mystical shadow down to her well-marked eyebrows. Her complexion was perfect of its kind. Her face and her slender throat were of an uniform pallor, but without a hint of ill health. Her long, ungloved hands lay half twisted in the gauze over her knees. Behind her, brightening her as an appropriate frame sets off a good picture, was a sheet of tall lily heads, and beyond them the garden, and beyond the garden, once more, Rome. He looked at this for an instant. Then he went on. Well, all that fits in, doesn't it, with what we agreed about the other day? We don't want this sort of thing now. I suppose there are some people who must have it, all the morbid and dark side. But it isn't the best. After all, the catacombs are underground, and we aren't, not yet. I'd much sooner be buried at sea, as a matter of fact, wouldn't you? I know what you mean, she said. Of course, death and so on are facts. I'm not a fool or a Christian Scientist. But why in the world think about them? Least of all in anything that resembles religion. I can't help thinking, how are your headaches, by the way? Oh, I promised not to ask, didn't I? He made an impatient movement with his cigarette, flicking off the ash. She had turned abruptly to ask her question, and was still looking at him. Oh, they're all right. At least, I take my medicine regularly. You take medicine? They're as bad as that? You've seen a doctor? What did he say? She asked sharply and concernedly. It gave him a little thrill of delight, in spite of his words. Oh, let's leave all that. No, but tell me, and then I won't ask any more. I went a couple of months ago. He told me that I had headaches, and then he told me to take some medicine, and then I paid him a guinea, no, two, because it was my first visit, and he told me to come again as soon as I got back from Rome. Did he seem to think it serious? Lord, no, not nearly so serious as I thought it myself, anyhow. I told him so, too. What did he say? He laughed. Who was he? Matheson, the brain man. You see, the local doctor recommended him. He's supposed to know everything that is to be known about the inside of all our heads. He's a surgeon, isn't he? I believe so. He didn't search me, anyhow, or even hint at it. That would be a bit too much, to make a hole in your head to let out a headache. I hate doctors. Yes, I see. Well, I hate being reminded of that sort of thing. I believe the way to keep well is not to think about it. You went, though. Well, I couldn't stand the thing any more. Now, Miss Bessington, for heaven's sake, let's leave that, but you'll go and see him again, won't you, as soon as you get back, as he told you? Her voice trembled ever so little, and even the heaviest fool could not have helped being flattered by it. And Neville was not a fool at all. He turned and looked straight at her. He knew it was unfair, yet the chance of making a tiny advance towards yet further intimacy was too tempting. "You wish me to?" he said. She flushed divinely, and then it was her turn to switch back the conversation. "Of course I wish all my friends to go and see doctors, if they're ill. I'm not a Christian Scientist either, you know. Now go on with what you were saying." So then they sat and talked in the sunlight. Voices came and went from beyond the wall, now and again. Once a bearded lay brother went past them in silence as they sat there, not even turning his eyes. It gave Neville another little text, and when the footsteps had died away, he made his remarks. "Now there's another illustration. Of course I know they're very holy people and all that, and I've not the slightest doubt that they think all the rest of us very worldly and all that. And yet, you know, I'm as convinced as much as I'm convinced of anything in the world that that's not the way to do it. If they lived up here in the garden all the time, it would be another matter. But they don't. They have their endless services out of books, and meditate on death, and deliberately give themselves pain." "Pain's a kind of physical sin, don't you think?" said Enid suddenly. "That's exactly it!" he cried in delight. "It's a thing to be resisted. It's hateful and detestable. I'd make acts of contrition for my headaches if I thought that was the best way to repent of them. And as for amendment, well, I'm sure I ask nothing better." 5. He walked up from his hotel to see the sunset from the Pincian that evening, and his mood was such that, viewing from afar the spruce figures of Mr. Hecker and Mr. Clow advancing towards him as he came up towards the church of the Trinità, he slipped swiftly into a small curiosity shop in order to avoid them. Thence, as in the dark interior he examined a plate of rings and charms on the counter, he saw them go briskly past. He still determined to give them 2 or 3 minutes to get well out of sight, and then, for very shame, felt himself obliged to buy something. He had almost decided on a small silver crucifix, when something else caught his eye, and he held it up, demanding what it was. "That is a seal, sir," said the man in broken French. Neville said he knew that, but what was the device? "That is the snake of Esculape," said the man, "the god of health." "I'll take that," said Neville. The view was superb when he reached it. The crowd on the top of the façade of the Pincian was so dense that he made no attempt to penetrate it, but he moved on to a comparatively empty space beyond, and sat down. First he looked at the view. Far beneath him stretched Rome. Roofs, towers, spires here and there broken by wide spaces, and the gulf of narrow streets, lay in one huddled mass, glorious in the evening light. Yet these appeared almost small, so tremendous and dominant was the great dome, which this morning he had seen so tiny, yet even then dominant, from the enclosure of St. Calixtus's cemetery. There it hung, of an indescribable blue, floating, it seemed, rather than supported from beneath, floating and transfused in a very sea of splendor, since the western sky not only lay behind it, but streamed through it, shining clear through the windows beneath the dome, as if light dwelt within as well as without the tabernacle in which the body of Peter the fisherman lay enshrined. It was this, of course, on which his eyes dwelt. They came back and back to it. There seemed no escape. The Jews had done their best, yet the dome of the great synagogue, resembled a vulgar nouveau riche beside this kingly dignity. The government was doing its best, yet the huge palace of justice seemed a house of cards. There was no question about it. St. Peter's remained inviolate. And then the boy's eyes fell on another sight, and he almost sighed with relief, for out to the right, poised on some tall hill of which he did not know the name, was a line of umbrella pines, as fine as lace, incredibly distinct, since every branch, and it appeared from here almost every twig, stood against the soft, rosy flush of the heavens. They, at least, were rivals of the dome, and they lived, while the dome enshrined, at the very best, only the dead body of a saint. He turned presently and looked at the crowd. They were of every nationality, yet their nationalities did not divide them. One line only cut them sharply into two camps. There were the ecclesiastics, and there were the laity. That, he thought he understood, was the essential difference. It is true that they were mingled physically, yet it appeared to the young man as if an unspannable gulf lay between them. There went a serpent of black-cassocked seminarians, younger men even than himself probably, going swiftly and steadily back, with flying sleeves, towards their college before Ave Maria should ring. And there played a group of children with shrill cries about a trimmed black poodle who barked in the midst. There an old priest leaned on the parapet, melancholy and brooding. And within a yard of him came a well-fed townsman, bold-eyed, light-bearded, in a well-cut suit, twirling a stick. There were the two camps. The former, with a terrible adequateness, preached and insisted upon pain and death as elements of life, as symbolized, it might be said, by the sign of the cross. Those, however inadequately, stood for the joy of life and simplicity and naturalness. It was not that Neville liked the town type. He hated it. Yet it was the nearer to the essential system of things, he thought, because more unstudied than the precise definitions of theology. So he sat, and so he considered, and mingled with all his considerations was the image of the girl with whom he had talked, as he had never talked with any other. There was his aunt at home. He was exceedingly fond of her, and there were certain kinds of things on which he could talk with her with utter confidence. If people were in trouble, he could imagine no more soothing comforter than Aunt Anna. Once or twice, lately, since he had come into his estate, he had had cases to deal with. There was a girl who needed an adviser. There was a mother who had lost her only son. Well, obviously, Aunt Anna was indicated. Or there were the Jesuit fathers at his old school. There was the Jesuit father at Farm Street, whom he occasionally consulted spiritually. Well, he could say things to those priests he could say to no one else. But he could not say the kind of things to them he had said to Enid. They simply would not understand. They would produce some dogma. They would argue that it was scarcely likely that the Catholic philosophers, even apart from dogma, were wrong and the pagan right. They would be sympathetic and kindly and understanding, that is, down to a certain level, yet utterly incapable of penetrating a hair's breadth below that level. At the most, they would just sum him up as tainted by modern agnosticism. Finally, there were the men he knew, many of whom had been with him at Stonyhurst, and to those, perhaps least of all, could he give his confidences. He could be genial and familiar with them, he could lend them £5, or borrow them. But the relationship was really extraordinarily artificial. He could not possibly touch on certain things. And even if he could, he knew what the response would be. One type would clap him on the back and tell him to go and take a blue pill. The other type would be grave and tell him to go and talk to Father so-and-so. Whereas with Enid, and he had scarcely known her more than 10 days. As the sky deepened and glowed above him, and as the evening chill began to drive home the prudent Roman crowd, 10 minutes ago the last child had been towed away by a voluble nurse, as the lights began to glimmer in the city beneath, and the ilex leaves above him to shiver in the faint breeze, which, like the sigh of a man as sleep begins to win upon him, marked the last movement of life before the stillness of the night, he began to see, he thought, the unity of all this. It was like a silent presence coming into a room which just now had been filled by conversationalists. All these minute and diverse details, even the roll of the wheels from the great cobbled circus beneath, clearer and sharper than even 10 minutes ago, the tossing rustle of the leaves, the lights that winked, went out, and then kindled again, those things seemed to him merged and fused together by the encompassing sky that was darkening so swiftly into one coherent spirit, a spirit of calm and assurance and freshness. And as he saw this, he saw too, he thought, that this was what he had found in Enid. She had silences like these, slight yet infinitely significant movements, as when she turned and said something, looking at him as she spoke, and then silences again. It was all one great and quiet spirit that penetrated the very depths of his heart, a spirituality that depended upon no forms, and therefore was limited by none, a comprehension that needed no words to express itself in. Then, as he looked out over the shadowy dome at the sky, passing itself even as he watched, from luminousness to opacity, there came out a single star that shook for an instant, like a light he had seen just now in the city, and then, again like that light, settled down into steadiness. The Great Spirit had gathered itself to a point. 6. He went up to his private sitting room almost immediately after a cup of coffee and a cigarette in the lounge of his hotel. The sight of all these people became a burden. What were they all about? A couple of men talked over cigars in a discreet manner in one corner, eyeing all the while every movement among the rest, following with their eyes a particularly superb-looking lady who wore an orange velvet dress. A very domestic party, with an Anglican clerical father in the midst, laughed and talked with true British reserve over some ridiculous card game. Two old ladies in caps with ribbons bent their old heads together and murmured gossip, no doubt, over their crochet work. They all appeared to him like marionettes, like shadow figures on a screen that jerked about with a semblance of life, but had no insides, so to speak. They were not really alive at all. They knew nothing worth knowing. So he went upstairs. It was an excellent room, so far as hotel rooms can be excellent, and he had done what he could to improve it. A bronze of Antinous he had bought during his second day in Rome stood on a pedestal of carved wood he had bought for it at the same time. A couple of old oil paintings rested on the mantel shelf. A gorgeous piece of antique silk, emblazoned all over with bees, and, in the midst, with a cardinal's hat and arms, lay over the corner of the screen. All those would be sent straight back to Hartley when he left. His writing table, too, looked homely. A couple of big silver frames held photographs, the one of a passionate-looking old man, the other of a middle-aged woman, gray-haired with a young face, with a boy in a sailor suit. These were, respectively, his father and his Aunt Anna, with Jim, her son. He stood looking at the second of these for a few seconds. Then he went through into his bedroom, turning on the light as he did so, and hunted about on his dressing table, but he could not find what he wanted. He came back into the sitting room and touched the bell, and then, before it could be answered, sat down at his writing table, took out a sheet of paper, and prepared to write. "Yes, sir," came a discreet voice presently. "Oh, Charleston, did you turn a seal out of my waistcoat pockets, the waistcoat I wore this afternoon?" "Yes, sir. Put it into the drawer of the dressing table, Sir Neville." "Oh, get it, will you? I couldn't find it." "Yes, Sir Neville." The man came back presently and laid it by his elbow. "Anything more, Sir Neville?" "No. Oh, yes. I said we'd leave on Easter Monday. I've changed my plans. I'm not sure. I'll let you know when we'll go." "Yes, sir." "And, Charleston." "Yes, sir." "I shall leave a note here with a little box when I go to bed. See that they're both taken tomorrow morning early to the address. That's all. I shan't want you again, Charleston. Good night." "Thank you, Sir Neville. Good night, Sir Neville."